So recently I bought the Corsair H150i Capellix RGB 360mm AIO liquid cooler. That's certainly a mouthful, and my first one actually came broken and I had to replace it. Hey guys, Tiago with Classical Technology here. Thank you for joining me for another video. Remember to subscribe, hit that notification bell, thumbs up. Let me know in the comments down below, have you seen this new liquid cooler? So recently, while needing a 360mm liquid cooler for my 10900K, I stumbled upon the Corsair H150i Capellix RGB. This has been recently announced and recently released. In fact, I saw it at Best Buy shelves, which is where I bought it, before I even saw any reviews for it. So I just figured I had a Corsair AIO before, the 280mm version, and I thought it was pretty high quality, cooled really well. So I figured, let me try this out. The new RGB system looks really cool. It comes with ML RGB Pro fans at the higher RPM now. I've always really liked these. So I bought it from Best Buy, and of course this is going to be what we can consider a premium liquid cooler at around $189, which is certainly pretty expensive considering you can get some like the Be Quiet 360mm pure loop for around 120 bucks, 360mm. So certainly you are paying a lot for that Corsair RGB and that ecosystem. So let's talk about what happened and some of my impressions later on of the replacement that I got. So as soon as I installed everything, and not to make that seem like a minimal task, it certainly is a little bit more of a time-consuming task installing a Corsair AIO, just because every fan has two different wires and cables. You basically have your PWM cable for your fan, as well as the RGB fan, which goes out to a separately included controller. And of course, that controller has to plug into SATA power, and it also has to plug in to your pump. And lastly, it also plugs into your motherboard's USB header. So as you can see, it's a little spaghetti contraption of all these wires and cables. Certainly very difficult to cable manage. You really have to take your time and sort of put everything in its place with zip ties. Anyway, after taking all that time and installing everything, I would turn it on, and while the fans came on, I would notice that the pump really wasn't lighting at all. So I went a little bit on a diagnostic run, making sure that all my cables were good, all my connections. I updated the firmware a few times. After updating the firmware, I would get the light to come on for very briefly. And then after a little while in the Corsair iCue system, I got sort of the error that said pump failure. Everything was blinking red. When the pump would sort of come on, it was blink, the fans will blink red, the pump would blink red, and then the light would turn off, and of course my temperatures would be going up really high. So after trying various things, making sure everything was plugged in correctly, making sure the firmware was updated, I pretty much came to the conclusion that I should trust what the software was telling me. There's a pump failure. It wasn't just some type of installation error or anything like that. So this happened, I mean, as soon as I turned it on. So it pretty much came dead on arrival. So I had to go back to Best Buy, return it, and I decided to give it another chance. So I did get another one, the same thing, the 150i. So after installing that, everything worked. No problems at all. The pump RGB turned right on. Everything was running fine. Temperatures were fine. So it really just happened that it was dead on arrival. I did mention this to a couple of people, and they said they've heard that people have had a similar problem. So hopefully it was maybe just the first batch. A couple were bad, but it's just something to keep in mind that there was this issue. The second one that I got worked completely fine, had no problems at all. So let's talk a little bit about the cooler itself. Now, the installation process on these AIOs, it's actually very straightforward. You just put in the back plate, and then you pull in the little screws in there, and then you put in the thumb cap that goes in between the CPU block, and it does come with pre-applied thermal paste. In the future, if you clean that off and you apply your own thermal paste, just make sure to do it properly, because that can certainly affect your temperatures. And when you have the mounting mechanism in there, make sure everything is nice and tight, and when you screw everything in, make sure things are tight but not too tight. You don't want to break anything. It's very important that a CPU cooler is actually mounted properly, because this can be one of the main causes of having instability and bad temperatures. Now, the installation process is pretty easy, aside from the fact that you do have a large amount of cables to deal with. Every fan has two, one for RGB, one for PWM. It may be a little difficult to keep things tidy with so much cabling going around and different components if your case doesn't have too much room or you don't have too much clearance in the back. So that's just something to keep in mind. But overall, I mean, the installation, aside from taking a little more time because of the extra cables and components, Pretty straightforward, got everything running, downloaded iCue software. Now the software, I do like it. I do like the sort of the different RGB integration. You can really customize a lot. The RGBs look fantastic on the fans themselves as well as the cooler. In fact, I have it right here, the LED set to white, so it looks really good. You can do all sorts of colors and combinations. You can sync it with your motherboard and with RAM, like I have the Corsair Dominator RAM in there, also white LED, so that looks really, really good. And you can also set all of your performance metrics. Now the pump, I do plug in directly to the CPU header on your motherboard. Some motherboards will give you an error if you try to boot without something plugged in sort of to the CPU header. Not all of them do. Sometimes you do water cooling and you have a separate controller for your PWM pump and fans, but then you will control your pump through that iCue software. You just set it to extreme. That's going to be sort of and when you set it to extreme, it usually reaches something like 27 or 2800 RPM. And they do have some other predefined sort of user inputs that you can put on there, like balanced and quiet and extreme. In my experience, all of these fan modes are a little bit too loud. Of course, extreme gets pretty loud, especially with these ML Pro RGB fans. The balance gets too loud under load as well, even the quiet. But thankfully, the Corsair iCue software does allow you to set your own custom fan curves, so you can actually have it top off at a lot less. You really don't need these bad boy fans screaming at 2200 RPM, certainly a little bit too fast. So you can do a custom curve, PWM curve, have them either stay at one fixed RPM, or you can do your own nice little curve that doesn't get too loud but still gives you good cooling. So very nice that you do have this sort of capability to control it. And I've used it before, even in water-cooled builds. You can connect different temperature probes and things like that, and you can even base the temperature out of water temperature. But here we're talking about an AIO, so basically the only thing we're dealing with is going to be the pump, which I like to keep at extreme and 100%, every time that I can, and the fans, which I like to run a lot lower just so they're not that audible. Now, in terms of the cooling performance on an overclocked 10900K, I thought it was actually really, really good. For example, in a room that's around 72 degrees Fahrenheit, it would seem after I did like a Cinebench run or even Prime 95 for a little while, initially the temperature would be right there at around 72 to 73 C. Of course, if you keep doing it and warm up the room and you get a little bit heat soaked, you start to go up a little bit, maybe like 75 C or something like that. So it's still pretty exceptional to be in the 70s with like something like Cinebench for an overclocked 10900K. And of course, it goes without saying that when you're playing games, generally the temperature would be around 72 C, which for a 10900K is really, really good. Of course, after getting a bit heat soaked, it can jump up to like 75 C or something like that if you keep running Cinebench. If you do Prime 95 long enough, it does seem to get up to 78 or 79 C after like a half hour or an hour. But in general, to be in the 70s with an overclocked 10900K, this is by the way on a Z490 Apex motherboard, I think that's pretty impressive. Those are pretty good numbers. I've gotten a lot higher numbers when trying other AIOs and air coolers, up in the 80s and even 90s. So certainly with the right fan curve and with the pump running at 100%, this Corsair AIO certainly does perform very, very well. And it even gets actually pretty close to like a custom liquid cooled system. So that's certainly not bad for this 360mm AIO. Now, in terms of the audible noise performance, because it doesn't matter if you're getting great thermal performance and it's really loud, it's like an industrial fan. Like I said, I would definitely set a custom curve for the fans. The pump can be run at 100%, and honestly, I don't even hear it. It's a very quiet pump. But these ML Pro RGB fans have very high RPMs. So when they start going into, the 60%, 70% RPM, you can certainly hear them. They certainly are fairly loud. But I found that when I do a nice custom curve where I kind of top them off at maybe 50% or lower, they're certainly not as loud, and the performance really doesn't change that drastically. Maybe you drop a couple of degrees or something like that. But in general, you can certainly keep sort of the noise under control while still getting great thermals. And that sort of goes with the 360mm size. You just have a lot more surface area in order to help dissipate that heat. So at the end of the day, is this something that I would recommend? Of course, I did have that little issue in the beginning where one came broken, but I mean, that can happen with many products, many manufacturers. Maybe this was just, one of the few errors that are out there. I did read about a couple more, which is a little bit disconcerting for such a new product, but it's so early that I think I would kind of forgive them for that. The second one works flawlessly. I didn't have any issue at all. At $189, it certainly is a very expensive AIO. It's not the most most expensive. You have the NZXT, like the Kraken, the Z73, which is more expensive, but you also have some AIOs that are significantly less expensive and perform actually pretty close to this. Maybe something like the EK 360mm AIO that they recently came out with. I also recently did a review of the Be Quiet Pure Loop 360mm AIO, and that's only 119 bucks, and the performance was actually remarkably close to this. The only thing you're not really getting in that, and that's why I think the Corsair is priced significantly higher. You get a lot more RGB in this. You get the fans, you get the cooler. Like in the Be Quiet, the fans are very high quality fans, but they're not RGB. So certainly having that Corsair ecosystem and that RGB for the fans, for the cooler, and that controller that lets you adjust everything in iCue, that certainly is providing some of that premium over some of these other products. While performance wise doesn't necessarily mean it's that big of a gap, you're just getting these other things that if they're important to you, if you have other Corsair components, certainly I think it's a very good AIO. Hey guys, I want to thank everybody again that joined the giveaway. Here are the 14 comments. I try to pick them almost as random as possible from different parts of the world, because I know a lot of people do watch me and everywhere in the globe, not only in the United States. Finally, the winner is going to be Zelo Scient. He is Mike from Texas, so congratulations. We'll be in touch. I hope everybody joined this giveaway, and don't feel bad if you didn't win. I do plan to do some more in the future as well. This was fun. It was great reading people's comments, very enjoyable. So enjoy your new GPU and stay tuned for more content. All right, guys, thank you for watching. Let me know if you have any questions down below. Remember to subscribe, hit that notification bell, and I'll see you guys on the next video.